1944, Monte Cassino, Italy. Smoke leaned low, carrying cold like a wet blanket. The aid station smelled of metal and morphine, singed wool and bitter coffee. The field generator coughed and died in the distance. A stretcher thudded onto canvas, and the man on it drew ragged breaths, each one a small, wet rustle as blood darkened his belt. A lantern hung from a hook, glass smudged, its leather strap nicked. Captain Edward Hughes kept his palm on the warm metal as if steadying the world. The commander slid inside, took 2 fast steps, and said, "He's the enemy." Ruth, fingers uncurling a photograph from the German's breast pocket, whispered, "He's a patient." She held up the picture, woman, 2 children, and for a long second the light seemed to wait. Edward unwrapped an oilcloth bundle and felt the blunt shape of a scalpel. As he lifted the lantern higher, the tent flaps shuddered and, in the thin light of a field hospital outside Monte Cassino, Mercy arrived where hate was expected. A surgeon's hands hovered over a German stretcher while a commander whispered that the prisoner should be left to die. Edward's oath, the promise to treat the wounded regardless of uniform, pressed against orders, and the nurse who held the lantern would be asked to hide more than bandages. That quiet decision would risk court-martial, fracture a team, and redefine what duty meant under fire. February 1944, on the battered slopes near Monte Cassino, a small forward aid station served as the thin hinge between frontline and field hospital. The unit was a curtained tent and a handful of medics and nurses, a captain surgeon, and an exhausted corps of orderlies. Their job was blunt: stop bleeding, blunt pain, and send the wounded back or onward. Triage meant quick choices. Who could be saved now? Who needed morphine? Who had a chance with surgery later? Supplies were stretched thin. 1 stretcher for several men, bandages scavenged from torn packs. Bottles of morphine counted like currency. Shelling hummed in the valley, trenches ran black across maps, and the risk of inspection or reprisal was real. The Geneva Convention set a simple rule: medical personnel and the wounded were to be treated as non-combatants. The medical oath Hughes carried was no poetry but a pledge to treat the dying man in front of him regardless of the uniform he wore. Oath over orders. Mercy over propaganda. Around the canvas, faces were worn into lines by too many long nights. Ruth moved with a practiced economy, fingers that could tie a tourniquet with the same gesture that smoothed a terrified brow. Edward listened to the low murmur of men folding the world into small, urgent chores, inventorying needles, counting morphine vials, while the commander's shadow passed like a verdict. To act on the oath meant more than saving one life. It meant risking the fragile cohesion of the unit and inviting questions that could end careers. Still, each medic there carried that silent calculus. A pulse is a patient, and choices made in the dark leave stains that last. A stretcher arrived with a thud that shook dust from the tent poles. Dirt clung to the man's sleeve like a map of trenches. His breaths were shallow and wet, the kind that made medics count seconds instead of heartbeats. Orderlies peeled back a torn greatcoat to reveal a uniform patched with mud, and someone muttered the word that changed hands into a weapon: German. Edward stood by the lantern hook, fingers still smelling of ether and coffee, and reached for a bandage roll as if it were the only sane thing left to hold. The field medics moved with the practiced silence of people who had seen the same injuries too often to be surprised, closing wounds with dexterous hands, passing scalpels, wrapping a folding stretcher. "He's losing a lot," one orderly said. "Keep pressure on the belt," Ruth replied. Even in a place measured by triage, decisions made by speed and chance, there was no rule for how a man's face in a photograph should weigh against a set of orders. The first duty was immediate: stem the bleeding, buy time, make a pulse worth noticing. The commander came through the flap like a question mark, boots clinking on wooden slats, his breath a quick report of the night's shelling. He glanced at the German, then at the American curled on the canvas 2 feet away, and gave instruction with the precision of someone who had learned to rule out complexity. "Do not waste blood or time on prisoners. Let him bleed out if you have to." The words were small and final, meant to conserve men and morale when the next shell could swallow both. Edward kept his hand on the lantern strap, feeling the scrape of leather and the heat where a bulb had recently been. The light made the German's face a map of exhaustion. Ruth, kneeling, slid one gloved hand into the man's breast pocket and brought out a photograph. Woman, 2 children, edges soft from being folded against the heart. She held it up like a defiance. "He's our patient," she said quietly. The commander's jaw tightened. His answer was less a sentence than an order disguised as concern. To obey meant a cleaner ledger and fewer questions from the brigade. To disobey meant court-martial, whispered reprimands, a ripple through a staff already holding together on the thinnest thread. Edward had learned to weigh such risks in seconds. The scale in his hands was light, until a face in a photograph added weight. They prepared a space under the canvas away from the main stretchers, clearing oilcloth, setting a shallow basin of boiled water to cool. Sterilization in the field was improvisation, a practical compromise between infection and survival. Instruments were few: a bone-handled scalpel, a pair of clamps dented from earlier use, sutures folded into paper, an ampule of morphine kept like a jewel in a drawer. Morphine was both mercy and ration. 1 ampule might ease a dying man's pain or steady a soldier through surgery. Ruth marked the remaining supplies on a scrap of paper. 2 vials of antiseptic, 1 needle, 3 bandage rolls. Outside, a generator coughed and then fell quiet. Their world narrowed to the pool of lantern light and the soft hiss of soaked cloth. "Where's the morphine?" Edward asked without looking up. "1 ampule. Save it for the cut." Ruth's voice was steady but very small. Every tool counted, every choice a calculus. Who received pain relief? Who could be stitched and moved? Who would be left to the sun? The oath that moved Edward's hands did not cancel the arithmetic of scarcity. It reframed it as moral arithmetic, where a pulse called for action, even if the ledger disagreed. When the tent flap was latched and the generator stilled to a hush, the lantern became a private sun. Ruth held it high, the glass rimmed with fingerprints, its light washing the German's face in a soft, human glow. Edward scrubbed his hands with a rag and boiled water, the motions so practiced they were almost prayer. The operation was not an operating theater, but a small choreography. Clamps placed, cloths tucked, a practiced incision made with the economy of someone who knew every motion would breed consequence. Instruments were counted aloud to keep both nerves and inventory in check. The scalpel slid and the world narrowed to the steady rhythm of sutures, thread passing through muscle and skin, each loop a promise of closure. There was a sound like a distant drum when a mortar hit a ridge. The tent shivered, and a tray of instruments chimed against one another. "Scalpel," Edward said. "Here," Ruth answered, her hand steady despite the tremor in her jaw. Working by lantern with only the barest measure of sterile field, they turned what they had into what the patient needed. Mercy here was not a proclamation, but a sequence of small, exacting acts. Halfway through, a noise outside, boots, then a cough, made both of them freeze. Footsteps paused at the flap, then moved on. The risk of discovery knotted their shoulders. If the commander returned, if an officer demanded accounts, their secret would be light exposed and liable to burn. Yet when the German made a long, soft exhale and his hand twitched by reflex, that simple movement steadied Edward like an anchor. He pressed a pad to the wound, tightened a suture, and kept his eyes on the pulse until the rhythm evened. In the dim, Ruth's knuckles were white on the lantern hook. She breathed in time with the man under the cloth. "The MPs?" an orderly whispered from the flap. "Not tonight," Ruth murmured, as if naming it might summon the patrol. Those who tended to the wounded learned to live with the fear of inspection. Each concealed needle or hidden morphine ampule was a small rebellion against the idea that mercy could be legislated out of duty. To keep someone alive sometimes meant keeping a secret. Word and rumor moved faster than bullets. By dawn, someone had noticed a bed left unemptied, a bandage that looked newer than its neighbors. The commander came back in daylight, eyes colder and questions thinner than before. He moved among the stretchers with the efficiency of someone auditing worth. Name tags checked, wounds catalogued, a ledger of salvage and loss. He stopped where the German lay, fingers tapping a map of dried bandage. "Why is he still here?" he asked, not looking for an answer, but for a reason that would fit a regulation. A corporal nearby frowned, the loyalty of his face ambiguous. "We patched him through the night," Edward said simply, palms still smelling of antiseptic. "Orders were clear." The commander's voice was a file closing. The accusation, unspoken at first and then sharp enough to bruise, traveled through the tent. To save an enemy was already a story told at half voices. Traitor, soft, sentimental. For those who had worked under Edward, the choice hummed like a wire, loyalty to law or loyalty to life. The German, who had been called by unit and number at first, was now a man with a name whispered by Ruth after she found it inside a seam. She folded the name into the palm of her hand like contraband, and began over the next hours to watch him as if supervision could keep a life steady. He woke once, eyes clouded, and reached blindly for the lantern. Ruth brought it down so that his face could try to place the people around him. He mouthed something that sounded like Heimat, a homeland, and the canopy filled with a small, impossible sorrow. An orderly brought in a stretch of Red Cross armband salvaged from a torn medic's coat and wrapped the German's arm in it to signal neutrality in case of checks. The simple act felt like both mask and truth. The Red Cross was meant to mark non-combatants, to demand mercy by treaty and by conscience. "Where are you from?" Ruth asked, in English thick with the language of exhaustion. "Kassel," he whispered. The name was a soft landscape. Small gestures, an armband, a cup of water, an unspoken name, became the underside of resistance. They were the ordinary ways people kept humanity alive when higher commands pretended it could be rationed. Rumors hardened into accusation by the time the supply truck rolled in. Men who had watched the tents through freezing nights now swapped glances and edged toward opinion. Someone had seen Edward moving the netting near the supply crates. Another swore they'd glimpsed Ruth washing a bandage far later than her shift allowed. The commander called a meeting that smelled of tobacco and impatience, and the squad gathered in a tight semicircle to hear what would be said of them. "We cannot have divided loyalties," the commander said. "Discipline wins battles." Faces flushed with defense. A medic remembered a comrade whose life had been saved that morning by an unrecorded act, and a private thought of his own brother's face. "He's a medic," one corporal protested. "A traitor is a traitor," the commander snapped. The charge of betrayal cut through the tent's thin canvas and into personal histories. Allegiance to orders or allegiance to an oath was not an abstraction here. It landed as a possible end to careers, to relationships, to the fragile trust that kept a unit whole. The tent smelled of boiled water and the iron tang of blood that would not leave cloth. Men who had been strangers the night before now measured loyalty in small gestures, covering a basin, folding a blanket, keeping the lantern light low when officers passed. Edward moved among them with a surgical calm that belied the weight behind his eyes. He answered questions in the same clipped tones he'd learned in training, names, times, vitals, and kept his real reasoning folded under the steady arc of a hand. When a private muttered that a man in a German uniform did not deserve kindness, Edward met him without anger. "He's a patient," Edward said simply. The private spat into the dirt. "He's the enemy." The exchange was short, but the tent listened. To medics, the language of classification, wounded, walking wounded, expectant, was daily arithmetic. To soldiers, labels carried moral force. The line between one and the other was a razor blade dressed as a rule. A man's wound did not ask his politics. The oath did not count his flag. Ruth found herself cleaning instruments at odd hours, hands numb from cold and long shifts, her thoughts moving between stitches and the photograph she kept folded in her pocket now. The German's picture, pressed beneath a bandage wrapper as if hiding proof of a small rebellion. She had been a nurse in a civilian hospital before the war and had learned that names anchor patients to more than pathology. Each time she touched his palm, she felt the tremor of another life, and the tent felt suddenly irresponsible for labeling that life as an expendable ledger item. When a corporal came by with a list of supplies to sign, Ruth delayed long enough to slip a clean bandage into the German's lap. The corporal noticed only the slip of paper, not the small mercy. "Why risk it?" he asked later, leaning on a post. Ruth answered without looking at him. "Because he reached for light." The reply was not a policy argument, but a human register. Gestures count where orders do not. Ruth's small acts stitched a private code into the public work of the tent. An unexpected problem arrived in the form of infection. A man returned from evacuation with a fever that had nothing to do with bullet or shrapnel, but everything to do with crowded bunks and scarce sanitation. The supply sergeant shook his head at Edward when Edward suggested diverting an extra vial of antiseptic. "We have to save it for our own," the sergeant said, tapping the scrap of inventory. Edward felt the ledger nudge him toward rationing antiseptic where he could. He also smelled the staleness of a dying man and knew that a single vial could mean the difference between life and a wasted body. He looked at the German, at Ruth, at the exhausted line of faces. "We allot what saves lives," Edward said. That night, Edward retreated to a corner and wrote in pencil a notation that hid among supply entries. One vial moved, one life held. He understood how small acts of redistribution could look like theft to some, charity to others. The medic's ethic had less to do with property than with pulses. Saving a life meant bending rules at the edges. News of the clandestine care leaked in ways rumor often does, half-remembered, exaggerated over mess hall gossip, sharpened by the need for moral outrage. A cook told a friend who told a driver who had a sister back at base. The rumor gathered adjectives, treasonous, soft, and began to harden. Men who had news to trade traded the story as if it were gossip of a different order, not about who flirted with whom, but about who preserved life for the wrong side. The commander felt the pressure that comes when rumor finds purchase. Accountability was not only military, but political. And in the middle of a campaign, image moved like a weapon. He paced the perimeter of the tent and called for discipline. "We can't feed the enemy and expect to keep fighting," he said. In the face of pressure, some hands folded and some reached. The medic's decision was now a lit match in dry grass. Winds of opinion threatened to turn it into a blaze. A nervous young orderly, new to the front and newly certain that rules were simpler than moral emergencies, confronted Ruth late one evening. He had seen her slip the Red Cross armband into the German's sleeve and had worked himself into a bright, trembling outrage. "You know what that'll get you?" he demanded, voice too loud for the narrow tent. "Court-martial! Jail!" Ruth looked at him without reproach. She had seen fear make men brittle. "We have a duty," she said, and it was not rhetorical. The orderly left, not satisfied, but quieter. The confrontation exposed how fear becomes a weapon against mercy. Where courage had felt private, the tent found its politics of survival. As daylight waned, the German's recovery acquired a rhythm. He could now swallow carefully and slept in the intervals between dread and relief. When he woke, his eyes tracked the lantern as if searching for something beyond the canvas. He whispered in halting English, then German. Ruth answered in broken phrases, and the interaction became a patchwork of human need. Once he gestured at the photograph, and then to the bandage on his arm. And Ruth understood that he was asking for the paper to be returned. She hesitated, and then handed it across the thin geography of fear. He smoothed the picture as if blessing it. "Family," he said, the word carrying a small, loaded world. To see him brush his thumb across a child's face in a photograph was to feel how deeply private Mercy could run beneath the public claims of a campaign. Tensions doubled when a supply inspection officer arrived unexpectedly. He was a man with a ledger and a distrustful expression, someone whose duty was to spot anomalies and make them speak in neat entries. He moved through the tent with the attention of someone collecting evidence, counting bandages as if each one were testimony. When he came to the German's cot, he paused, then raised an eyebrow at the Red Cross armband. "Where did you get that?" he asked. The question was routine, but the implication was social dynamite. Edward kept his gaze level. He had learned how to manage officers with quiet clarity. "We found a strip in a supply crate," Edward said. The reply satisfied the inspector enough to move on, but the incident left a taste like metal. Supplies were not merely materials, but signals. How they were used could be read as a kind of language. Improvisation in a tent could be misread as insubordination in a report. A moment of tenderness arrived unexpectedly when the German, now able to sit, asked for a cigarette. Cigarettes were a common currency. Soldiers traded them like coins. Edward did not smoke, but he kept a small tin of tobacco for men in pain or to barter for favors. He opened the tin and handed a cigarette to the German with hands that still carried the smell of iodine. The man tried to light it and failed. Ruth leaned in and struck a match with a practiced flick, setting the ember and handing him the small comfort. For a second, the tent was a place where a tiny habit bridged the war. "Thank you," the German mouthed, the phrase different and the meaning the same. Small comforts do not rewrite orders, but they reshape the immediate moral geography of a tent. A shared smoke could complicate the neat story of enemy and ally. The more ordinary hours passed, the more the tent's politics calcified into factions. Some argued in low voices that any leniency eroded morale and order. Others quietly said that to be a medic was to answer to a higher law. A chaplain visited one morning and found the air heavy with the weight of choices. He listened to the men speak, and then he stood at the German's cot and said nothing doctrinal, only that mercy is often an act of courage. His presence did not settle matters, but it offered a spiritual vocabulary that some medics used when they could not use military language. "God doesn't color by uniform," the chaplain said softly. The remark lingered not as doctrine, but as a quiet permission. Moral claims sometimes outgrow the boxes used to contain them. Yet the cost of secrecy and the proximity of danger were not abstract. Paperwork mattered. Supply lists, casualty reports, and anomalies collected like pebbles that could be flung into a well. Someone had noticed that a ration meant for another unit was missing. Another had seen fresh laundry late at night. Suspicion set up a network of small evidence that could be assembled into accusation. The commander tightened protocols. Sign-offs were demanded where before there had been trust. He asked for names of those who had volunteered for extra shifts, and the tent felt its privacy diminish. For some, the choice to shelter a wounded man was now a political line drawn in mud. "Discipline is necessary," the commander said in a tone that left no room for debate. The tent responded with quiet defiance or fear depending on the man, but the moral calculus had shifted from individual action to collective risk. Ruth began to sleep in short bursts and with one eye open. The weight of hiding a life pressed on her like an extra layer of clothing. She washed her hands until the skin became raw and still checked the German's pulse before she allowed herself to lie down. When she took inventory, she found one bandage missing that she couldn't account for. She had used it for a wound that needed covering. The ledger had no language for such improvisation. In the quiet hours, she would press the photograph to her chest and think of small domestic things: a stove, a garden, a child's laugh. Those images held a peculiar power. They humanized the enemy not as an abstract foe, but as an inhabitant of the same fragile world. "Your oath is to the patient," she told herself. And the phrase was both mantra and shelter. Those private repetitions sustained action when public sanction threatened to unmake it. An enlisted man named Dodd, who had worked with Edward since Sicily, became the unexpected hinge. He had seen firsthand what happened when a medic refused to act, friends lost in a hurried triage, and he had also seen how rumor could bruise reputations. Dodd's loyalty to Edward was not blind, it was fracture-tested. He approached Edward one night with a look that was all blunt edges. "If this gets us in trouble," he said, "I stand with you. For the men you've saved." Edward's relief was small and quietly relieved, as if a heavy coat had been taken off. Their conversation was terse because both men understood that words could be overheard. "We do our job," Edward replied. A private pledge like that did not end the risk, but it shifted the balance inside the tent from isolation to a fragile solidarity. As word of loyalty spread, so did fear of betrayal. An orderly whispered that someone had seen Ruth near the commander's vehicle the night before. Others said that a note had been tucked into the supply crate. The tent became a place where every action was suspect and every kindness potentially incriminating. The medics learned the cost of moral work. It exacted not just physical strain, but social risk. They traded stories in low voices, of a doctor who had been court-martialed for refusing an order, of a nurse who had been praised for staying by a dying enemy. But the tales were not neat parables, they were warnings with teeth. To work in a field hospital is to live constantly at the margin of permission and transgression. One dawn, the German murmured in his sleep, and then reached for the lantern as if at habit. He woke fully and looked around at the faces that had become, in the passing days, the geography of his survival. He tried to stand and failed. Ruth lifted him gently and fed him a sliver of bread. He blinked, the sharpness of recognition returning, and then, with effort, formed a question in German that Ruth only half understood. Edward, listening, stepped closer and answered in his broken German, "Rest. You are safe here." The phrase was simple and complicated at once. "Safe?" the German echoed, as if testing the word for weight. Safety in a war zone was a fragile declaration. It was also an act that required daily reaffirmation against the noise of orders and the storm of rumor. As days passed, the small acts of care became harder to hide and yet more embedded in the routines of the tent. The German's hair was cut, his wounds redressed, and he now wore a patched uniform that blended into the generic wear of all soldiers in a way that made him less conspicuous. The Red Cross armband, once a deliberate signal, came to feel like a gentle, necessary camouflage. Men who had at first been indignant now passed without comment, either out of fatigue or because the urgency of their own wounds made them indifferent. The tent's external world kept turning. Shelling continued, radios brought brief, bright flashes of news, and orders arrived and were implemented. The moral question of the Germans' survival moved from hot debate to a quieter, persistent presence in people's daily decisions. Each day of care was a vote cast for mercy against the louder voices that demanded otherwise. At dawn, the commander returned with men to seize the prisoner. Edward stepped into the narrow light, palm flat on the stretcher as a barrier. "You can't take him," he said, voice even. Ruth kept the lantern trained on the man's face. Edward signed the log and spoke a single sentence that carried his oath. "Today, he is a patient. My oath is to that first." Then he rolled up his sleeves and set his body firmly between them and the bed. The tent held its breath. The Red Cross armband hung stained from the hook. An empty ampule sat in the tray like a small verdict. Faces shifted, some with gratitude, some with suspicion, and a spare line in the ledger quietly noted an unclaimed vial. Years later, Ruth folded the photograph into a pocketbook, and the lantern's strap kept its scar. Strength is restraint. Civilization is a choice. If this account moved you, subscribe for more true stories of medicine and mercy under fire.